If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are three things you need to do: understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first two steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, editor, poet, and award-winning author of middle grade novel Jet Cooper, and I help writers identify and solve their story problems.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm an author and a story editor, and I teach women who are writing in all genres how stories work so they can finish their books faster and without frustration.
On today's episode, Valerie pitched Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris so that we can study the four types of protagonists. This 2022 film was directed by Anthony Fabian from a screenplay by Anthony Fabian, Carol Cartwright, Keith Thompson, and Olivia Heatreed. It's based on the 1958 novel of the same name by Paul Gallico. Now, of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And please help other writers find our show by leaving a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll to the bottom. It's that simple. And if you're watching us on YouTube, please hit the like button and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. All right, Valerie, over to you to talk about what type of protagonist Mrs. Harris is.
All right. Yes, this season I am studying the four types of protagonist, and the four different types are categorized according to their relationship to not only the reader, but also the reader or viewer, but also the characters in the story. Now, when I chose this movie, I had hoped, I hadn't seen it, but I had hoped that the protagonist, Ada Harris, was an example of the every woman. Turns out she's not. Hopefully, there will be another example of that as the season goes on. You know, that's how it goes. There are certain actors actually who have made a whole career out of playing the everyman or every woman, like Tom Hanks, Meg Ryan, Hugh Grant. Audiences love this type of character. Readers love this type of character. Why? Because they're just like us, right? We relate to them. We empathize with them very quickly because we recognize who they are immediately. And empathy is key, right? I mean, that's what we're trying to do here. Establishing an emotional connection with the protagonist is the goal for us as storytellers. We want our reader or viewer to have an emotional connection with our protagonist right away. And so if you're using an every man or every woman, the job is kind of, I was going to say half done for you. That's not quite true. But the job is made easier for you because the character is starting out on equal footing with your audience member. All right. In saying that, though, while Mrs. Harris is not an example of an every woman, she is a terrific example of another type of protagonist, which is the underdog. Now, all audiences, all readers, viewers love the underdog most of all. This is our most favorite type of protagonist. And that is because they are us in our most challenging times. When all the cards seem to be stacked against us and nothing seems to be going our way. And in those times when, we're going after the big win, like we want the job or, we want the girl or we want the whatever it is we're going after. And there's all of these hurdles, all of these seemingly insurmountable obstacles in our way. We are the underdog. And so when we read stories that feature an underdog, we immediately cheer for them. We root for them. We want them to win because if they can overcome all of the things that they're up against, all the people, all the circumstances, then maybe, just maybe, we can too. Now, the keys to making an underdog protagonist work are these. First, you need a very clear object of desire. then you also need a very clear reason for the character wanting what they want. And it has got to be meaningful. Often, not always, but often, the reason why they want the thing, it has to do with their feeling of self-worth, or our feeling as an audience of what's right and just in the world. Like it's right that they win that thing because they're a good person or whatever. So there's some sort of emotional reason, morality, internal reason for them wanting the thing they want. They want to win the race because it's going to prove to themselves that they are worthy, or that they can do it, or that they got the right stuff, or they can go the distance, right? That's the whole thing about Rocky. He's an underdog. He wants to go to the distance because he has to prove to himself that he's not a bum. One of the reasons why audiences love Rocky. And the other thing that an underdog story needs for it to work really great is that the protagonist needs to be active and proactive. In other words, they've got to be taking active steps toward getting what they want. They've got to earn their victory. It can't just be handed to them because that's an empty victory. They've got to earn it. They've got to get the bruises and cuts and scrapes and get what they want. Yes, we want them to get their object of desire. We want underdog stories to end on a high note. But we want a feeling at the end of the story that, yeah, they earned it. They should win. They should get that thing that they really wanted. Okay. In saying all that, sadly, this highlights problems with Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris. Yes, Leslie Manville's performance is incredible. I mean, no surprise there. I love Leslie Manville. The costume design is gorgeous. Truly, truly. If you like costume design, this is a movie you want to watch. The overall look and feel of the film is stunning, and it draws your eye in visually. But none of those things are story related things. Like that's not what we control as writers. None of that stuff is in the script. Now, while there is a very clear object of desire, which is a Christian Dior dress, Ada Harris happily accepts that the specific red dress she wants most of all the beautiful dresses that she saw at the fashion show, she happily accepts when a rich woman buys it, sort of doesn't steal it, but buys it before Ada can buy it, and buys it specifically so that Ada cannot have it. Ada just accepts that. There's no problem with it. And so instead of the red dress that she really wants, she accepts the green dress, which is lovely, but it's not the one she wants. So the object of desire here is not simply a Christian Dior dress. And we got to be careful here because it's very easy to sort of say, yeah, she wants a dress, box ticked, move on. No, she wants, and at first that's what it seems like, but no, she wants the red dress, number 89, which is called Temptation. And when Madame Avalon buys it out from underneath her, Ada accepts the loss of this object of desire and settles for dress number 76, which is called Venus. Now, what effect does this have on the viewer? Well, if Ada doesn't really care which dress she has, then we don't really care which dress she has. And so the whole desire for a Christian Dior dress is instantly diluted. The value of this object of desire to Ada has decreased. And so therefore it has decreased for us as well. What's more, and I think this is far more problematic, to be honest, is that it isn't clear to us why Ada wants the dress. As many of the characters say multiple times, she has no use for it, and very likely she'll never wear it. So what does having a Christian Dior dress mean to Ada? It's not clear. Will it help her deal with her grief over finding out for sure that her husband was killed in battle. In her heart, she already knew this. The war ended 12 years earlier, and she hadn't heard a word from her husband since. And yes, she loved her husband. This is her beloved Eddie. So it's very clear that she was deeply in love with her husband, and that's why she needed concrete proof before she would accept that he was dead and wasn't coming back to her. We can understand that. That is part of what makes her an underdog. The question is, does getting the dress help her deal with the realization that he is now dead? I mean, you can say that, but honestly, I think that's really a massive stretch. I think we are really reading into something that is not in this film version. It might be in the novel. I don't know. I've not read the novel. But in this movie, in this particular 2022 film version, I am really grasping at straws to say that. And if getting this dress does help her deal with the grief, like how? Why would a Christian Dior dress do that? Well, Ada interprets it, I think, as a final gift from her husband, that he is somehow from the beyond setting up the situation so that she can have this Christian Dior dress. And again, you could argue that, yes, he wanted her to find love by having this beautiful dress, and so that Archie would see her in this beautiful dress and fall in love with her, and she would live happily ever after. Sure, you can say that. Again, I think it's stretch, like a super, super stretch. But okay, you can have that read if you want. Add to that, if we are going to say that this is a gift from Eddie so that she can have a happily ever after, and if we accept that the green dress is fine, that she can do without the red dress that she really wanted, even if we accept all of that, it all goes right down the drain at the end of the movie when Ada very quickly and easily and happily gives the dress away, like immediately. She has just gotten home from Paris and she gives the dress away to Miss Penrose. I mean, Miss Penrose of all people. You know the dress is going to be destroyed because that's Miss Penrose. She doesn't care about anything or anyone but herself. She's completely selfish. She's a complete pig. And all her clothes is always thrown all over the place. You know this dress is not going to make it to the end of the movie. So if the dress was so special to her and a gift from her departed husband from the beyond, why does she part with it so easily? Again, if it doesn't matter to her, it doesn't matter to us. Furthermore, Ada is a passive character. Now, she's not completely passive. It's not 100% passive. I don't mean that. But this movie relies very heavily on coincidence. And that, my friends, is dangerous territory. Now, Melanie and I here on the podcast have talked a lot about active and passive characters in the past. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that right now. I mean, you can go back and listen to past episodes because I think there's another really important lesson here that we can learn from Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris. And that lesson has to do with genre and really knowing inside and out the genre that you're writing in. Now, Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris is charming. And if you look at Rotten Tomatoes, it's got like a 90 some odd % rating, positive rating on Rotten Tomatoes. So audiences clearly enjoyed it. Like I said, Leslie Manville is a delight. I mean, she really, I don't know how she managed to work with that script, but she is charming. I just love her. I think she did an amazing job. Like I said, the costumes are a feast for the eyes. You can't deny that. And the story world, like the time period, it's Paris, it's the fashion industry, it's the House of Dior. I mean, all of that. I mean, it's just so delicious to sort of hang out in that world for a little while. So, if it's got the story problems that I say it's got, why do audiences like it so much? Why does it have this 94 or 95% positive rating on Rotten Tomatoes? This is the conclusion I have come to. And Melanie, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this. It's because Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris is a fairy tale. And fairy tales have underdog protagonists who are mostly or even entirely passive. They are disadvantaged in every way, and then one day, presto magico, through no action of their own, they have these incredible strokes of luck that just change their lives. I mean, this is Cinderella, right? This is Sleeping Beauty. It's Snow White, and on the list goes. The fairy godmother shows up, just shows up and waves her magic wand, and Cinderella gets to go to the ball. Or the handsome prince, who's also rich, happens to show up and just kisses Sleeping Beauty, and she wakes up and everything is great. I mean, could there be a more passive character than Sleeping Beauty? I don't know. And there's even a part of us, it might be a huge part, it might be a small part, but there is a part of us, even if we don't want to admit it, that secretly hopes that someday someone will magically appear in our own lives and make all of our troubles go away. We just really hope that someone shows up with a magic wand and says bippity boppity boo and things work out. Like little girls are raised to believe that one day the prince will come, right? That some gorgeous, rich, loving, supportive man will just knock on our front door and we don't have to do anything. We don't have to, kiss all those frogs. He will just appear. Or that, like I said, if we say the magic words, bippity boppity boo, that a Mercedes will appear in our driveway and it's fully paid for. It's got a lifetime supply of free gas and all the insurance is covered. And the thing will never break down. No one will ever key our car. Everything will just be great if we can only say bippity boppity boo, and it's wonderful. Now, I mean, we know that none of this is true. But there is a little part of us that desperately wishes it was true. And fairy tales, well, they're for little girls, right? Well, I think Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris is a fairy tale for grown-up women. We know the truth of the world. We've gotten banged around a few times in life. We've got our bruises and our cuts from the world. But for these 2 hours, we get to escape into a movie that allows us to dream that maybe if it can work out for Ada Harris, maybe some guy will show up at our door and tell us we just made a fortune on a bet we didn't even know we made. Like Archie, right? Says she won all this money at the racetrack and she didn't even know she had made a bet at the racetrack. Like, wouldn't that be nice? So all of this to say, this is why we really need to understand the genre that we're writing in. Because if this wasn't a fairy tale, and if we didn't see it as a fairy tale with all of, the particular conventions of a fairy tale, like, for example, a passive character, like, for example, all these coincidences and people just showing up to solve your problems, people just giving you all these roses, people just giving you these gorgeous, one-of-a-kind designer Dior dresses, then Ada's passiveness and all these coincidences are big problems. Big problems. And if I'm being fair, I did find the coincidences problematic. I felt it drained all of the tension out of the story. There were times when I had trouble suspending my disbelief, and it happened over and over again to the point where I was predicting them. I could see them coming a mile away. And so if it wasn't for the gorgeous costumes and for the incredible talent of Leslie Manville, I would have bailed. Even though in my heart as well, I really wish that someone had a magic wand and could wave it and I could say bippity boppity boo and my book was number 1 on the New York Times list, or that some publisher somewhere sent me a check for $1 million in royalties or something like that. It's not how it works, but we can hope, we can dream. Anyway, Melanie, I'll just leave it there for now. How did you go this week?
Well, I just want to make a point of the fairy tale I just want to like clarify not clarify, but talk about fairy tales a little bit. So you're right in that it's a fairy tale, but it's more specific. It's a Disneyfied fairy tale. Because
Ah, yes.
if you read proper fairy tales, and I'm a member of the Australian Fairy Tale Society, so if you read proper fairy tales, and I mean more traditional type of fairy tales, you will know that they are pretty gruesome. There are really quite brutal things in fairy tales, but this is the Disneyfied version that you're talking about, right? Where things
Yes.
happen and the magic is used in this way, and there's nothing, malicious about it, or there's a really super evil villain like Maleficent or those types of villains in the stories. So you're right, but I would be more specific and saying it is a Disneyfied type of fairy tale fantasy that Mrs. Harris, that's what I would classify it as,
Yes, I
because
think you're right. Yes.
yeah, it's that very optimistic, very, sort of, magical coincidences happen, but fairy tales in their true essence, and depending on where they come from and their source of origin, are really, they are not. They don't always have happy endings. They don't always have good outcomes. Like, the French version and the Italian versions of Cinderella have the ugly stepsisters cutting their toes off to fit into the glass slipper. So these are gruesome, gruesome stories that have quite brutal elements in it. So I think Disney has really done a job on taking those stories and making them fantasy, like, that these optimistic and these overly optimistic coincidences and good things. Whereas, yeah, but I agree with you. There's a fantasy element about this, and I think it fits in with a Disneyfied fairy tale. So
Yeah, that's a
I
great
just,
clarification. No, I'm glad you said that because, I mean, you know more about fairy tales than I do, but when I think of fairy tale, my brain did exactly go to Disney. And I mentioned,
yeah,
it was the Cinderella, Disney version of Cinderella that
yeah,
was in my mind, right? Um,
yep.
so yeah, that's an excellent insight. Thank you.
No, and I think I can see that too. I think that's some way why we're a bit disappointed in it as well. Like you said, that it's just, all these magical things happen, and we know in real life that that's not. We've outgrown that
We've
those
outgrown it,
types of stories.
and it became so predictable so quickly that it
Absolutely.
became kind of boring,
Yes.
right? And uninteresting. I had no curiosity. My curiosity waned very quickly. Um, and like if your reader, or in this case, a viewer, can see what's coming and they're right, because they'll always sort of, I mean, it's our nature to try and guess what's going to happen. But if they are guessing what's happening and they're right all the time, and in this case, it was all the time, why should they bother reading your book? Because they got other stuff to do.
Yeah.
Right? I've never met
Yeah.
anyone who sat down and said, I have absolutely nothing to do.
Yeah.
I've met
Yeah.
people who said, I really don't want to do the things I have to do, but
Yes.
no one's going to sit there and go through a whole book where they know exactly what's going to happen. Cause takes a lot more work, mental work, to read a novel than it does to just sit passively on a sofa and watch a 2-hour movie. So we're already asking our readers to work harder than they would if they wanted to watch a movie, which is why so many people say, thanks, I'll wait for the movie, because it's hard work to read the book. So
Yes.
give them a reason to read your book by zigging when they think you're going to zag. I mean, that's
Yeah.
part of the craft of
Absolutely.
the storyteller. That's part of our job, a big part of our job.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
I'll
That's
stop
right.
talking
And
now.
no, it's interesting that like all those points that you made come out in my study of the premise and log lines this week as well. And and I'm going to break that down a little bit. And it also, I think, means it gives us another way to use a premise and a log line in terms of identifying story problems at the big story at the big story level, so at the macro level of story. And I think that hopefully what I'm going to put forward this week is that it's invaluable to have a premise, which is a 1 or 2 line sentence that gives scope to your story, but also provides bumper rails for you so that you don't go off track when you're writing, or you at least stick to it and know what your story is about so that you can avoid the mistakes like that we've identified in Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris. Now, as part of my study this season, I'm going to use 5 different summary sentences that I'm testing out to see which one is best or which one is the most useful. Now, some of these sentences are premises and others are log lines, but both are important. And as I go through this week, we'll start to see how they're important and what they can actually do for us. Now, the biggest difference between a log line and a premise is that a premise should give you a sense of the ending, and a log line is meant to leave the reader or the listener, if you're using especially the log line in a pitch, it's meant to leave the receiver wanting more. So they have a slightly different intention, even if they use some of the same story information. Now, the logline formula that I've tested so far this season is one that has a formula like this. So we have the inciting incident, the protagonist, the action, and the antagonist. But the log line that I want to look at this week is slightly different, or the formula is slightly different, and that is that it has the protagonist, the action, the antagonist, the goal, and the stakes. Now, as I've mentioned in episode 1 this season, log lines use key story information. And if you've listened to season 13, when Valerie discussed the 4 story questions, you'll know what those pieces of story information are, and you'll know how those questions can help you understand the story you're writing, but also create the log line, because all of that information in both of those formulas is pretty much contained in those 4 story questions if you answer them properly. Now, it's a very logical question to ask. So if I'm studying a premise or the premise, then why am I looking at log lines? Well, the very honest answer is that I didn't mean to. It just happens to have happened this way this season. Now, even though we're only 3 episodes into this season, what's happened is that I have a clearer understanding already of what a premise is and how to use it. And I also have a far greater understanding of what a logline is for, how to write one, and also how to use it in copywriting and promotional material. So again, really invaluable things that I've learned already this season in episode 3. Now, this is super handy because I can use both of these sentences or these concepts in a different way. I can use them both, but in different ways. However, if the premise includes a sense of the ending, but you're not sure how the ending goes when you start plotting your novel, I think that a log line is going to be enough to get you started or to get you going. And the premise, and you'll be able to write the premise once the story becomes clearer to you and you work out what your ending is going to be. Now, having said that, I love plotting, right? And I like to have a sense of the ending before I start writing. Now, that doesn't mean it won't change, but I do like to have a sense of the ending before I start writing. But the main point that I want to reinforce here is that if you know your 4 story questions or you know the answer to those questions, you should be able to write your log line with no trouble whatsoever. Despite, it doesn't matter what formula you use, you should be able to write that. Now, today I'm going to read 4 summaries of Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris, and I found these four summaries on various movie web pages, and I'm going to see if they work as a premise or a log line. So here we go. The first one is, Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris follows Ada Harris, a London cleaning lady in the 1950s, who pursues her dream of owning a Christian Dior gown, leading her on an enchanting Parisian adventure that transforms her life and touches those that she meets. Now, I sourced this document. I think it was actually a consolidated description of the movie. So there wasn't one attributable source to that. So I have a feeling that it's probably an AI generated consolidated summary of the movie. Now, the second summary is a 1950s London cleaning lady falls in love with a haute couture dress by Christian Dior and decides to gamble everything for the sake of this folly. And that comes from Just Watch US. And I would say that, and the site actually says that this is the synopsis of the story. Now, the third one. The widowed cleaning lady falls madly in love with a couture Dior dress and heads to Paris to buy one of her own. And that's what's on the Apple TV website as a summary of the movie. And then finally, the fourth one is in 1950s London, a widowed cleaning lady falls madly in love with a couture Dior dress, deciding she must have one. She embarks on an adventure to Paris that will change not only her own outlook, but the very future of the House of Dior. And that's from IMDb. Right. So very interesting, right? These log lines, these summary sentences, they're very similar. They have very common features. But let's look at this and contrast this against the logline formula that I'm going to use this episode, which is, again, the protagonist, the action, antagonist, goal, and stakes. Now, in my opinion, all of those summary sentences are log lines. To identify the stakes, so an example is the future of the House of Dior. So there's something at stake in that description. But none of the versions above include an antagonist. And the copywriters, I think, have used the first example of a log line that I have been using in the first 2 episodes of this season to write the description. So again, it doesn't have an antagonist, and it doesn't really, some of them don't have what's at stake if Ada fails in getting her object of desire. Now, what I find interesting about the absence of an antagonist in the logline is that this reflects one of the problems that I had with the movie. Now, don't get me wrong, it's a delightful movie and there are problems that Mrs. Harris faces, but there wasn't a central antagonist or even a strong force of antagonism in the movie. And the antagonist that forces Mrs. Harris to do something different by the end is that silly girl, Pamela, right? And we meet Pamela at the beginning and we see her again at the end, but she does not have any impact on the middle build of the story or what happens in the middle of the story at all. So she's quite an ineffective force of antagonism, apart from a slight annoyance to Mrs. Harris at the beginning and then destroying her beautiful Dior dress at the end. So as a result of this and looking at the log lines, I tried to identify what the main force of antagonism for the movie was. And at a stretch, I would say that it was the cost of the dress. But Mrs. Harris overcomes this very early in the movie. Now, thinking about the 2 logline formulas that I've looked at so far, I think I prefer the second one because it identifies the antagonist. And I think that this formula is actually more useful for us as writers, and it makes for a more interesting hook to get readers and viewers interested in our stories. So that's just some thoughts about the premise and that's just some thoughts about the log line and the log line formulas. I just want to go and have a look at a premise now for Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris. Now, last episode, I tested Dwight V. Swain's story premise method from his book, The Techniques of the Selling Writer, and I liked it a great deal. So I'm going to use it again this week. Now, Swain proposes that there are 5 key elements in every solid commercial story, and he calls these 5 elements the lineup. And when arranged in a certain order, they give a writer a basic 2-sentence outline so the story is clear. And so the 5 elements of the lineup are the main character, the situation, so it's the trouble that forces them to act, the object of desire or the character's motivation, the opponent, so the force of antagonism, and then the disaster. So this is really the climactic moment where the protagonist faces something awful and that leads them to the crisis and the key moment in the story. Now, when we combine those different elements, we use the first sentence, which is a statement, and it establishes the character, the situation, and the objective. The second sentence is a question, and it nails down who the forces of antagonism are, or what the force of antagonism is, and the disaster. All right, so let's go through this for Mrs. Harris. So the main character is Mrs. Harris. Her situation is that it's been over a decade since the end of the Second World War. She is a cleaner, and she receives the news that her husband won't be returning home. And she longs for something to give her hope. And again, I think that's me trying to stretch and read a few things into the story, but I think that's what happens, or that's the situation. And the object of desire, or Mrs. Harris's motivation, is that in her grief, she sees a Dior gown that her wealthy employee owns, and the dress inspires her to have a dream of owning her own Dior gown. Now, the opponent or the force of antagonism, I think I've listed them in dot points of there's money, there's time, elitism, snobbery, class, and carelessness. And again, I actually think that this is problematic because without one big main force of antagonism, I think the story suffers, although all of these things feature in the little hurdles or the little conflicts that Mrs. Harris has to deal with. And then the disaster is that the House of Dior doesn't want Mrs. Harris to be fitted for her haute couture dress because the gatekeepers believe that she will never wear it. Now, this is where it starts to get really interesting. So here is how the lineup and those elements of those 5 story elements, this is how I've woven them into those 2 sentences that Swain talks about. The first is that Mrs. Harris, a cleaner from World War II, England, learns that her husband won't be coming home, and she sees a Dior dress in a wealthy client's wardrobe that sparks her dream to own her own Dior gown. The second question, or the second sentence, which is a question, is can Mrs. Harris raise enough money and convince the House of Dior to accommodate her short stay in Paris to fulfill her dreams of owning her own unique gown? Now, the second sentence is meant to define the story's climax and clarify the story's conflict. However, I ran into the same problem when I was looking at the log lines, when I was looking at writing this line-up sentences. The main source of antagonism or the main source of conflict isn't clear. And along with the climactic moment in the movie, which I've identified as Pamela destroying Mrs. Harris's dress, it doesn't actually line up with the sentence. So yes, Mrs. Harris's friends rally around her. They rally together to get her another Dior gown, but it's all rather convenient. And it has a touch of Machina ex Deus about it. So I thought, and I thought the same about Mrs. Harris's desire to get money for the dress as well. It all just kind of happens magically, even if she does have a minor setback. Now, what the logline formula and Swain's lineup show us this week is that using such tools can help you identify problem areas in your story. Yes, Mrs. Harris is a lovely feel-good movie and the cast is great, but it was missing something, and that something was the conflict, which should be caused by strong forces of antagonism. And if we go back to season 2, when I studied the forces of antagonism, one of the things that came out of that study was that the protagonist is only as good as the forces of antagonism that they come up against. Now, not once did I fear that Mrs. Harris would miss out on getting the red dress. As soon as that came on the screen and as soon as I saw that she wanted, I knew that by the end she would have the temptation dress. And I was never in any doubt that that would happen, which links back to what Valerie was saying about tension. There really was no tension because for not one moment did you think that she wasn't going to end up with that dress. All right, so log lines and the lineup method are two ways that we can test our story ideas to see if they are strong enough to write a satisfying story. Right, Valerie, what are your final thoughts about Mrs. Harris?
Well, first of all, just listening to everything that you just said there, I mean, one of my final thoughts is that you want to avoid coincidence because it drains the conflict out of your story,
Mm.
and therefore the antagonist doesn't get to do their job. This is why you had so much trouble finding the antagonist. There was, like you said, there was lots of little things that popped up, but they were all overcome so quickly and so easily, often without Mrs. Harris having to do anything at all, that they were at best toothless antagonists, and that's not going to cut it. So final thoughts is you want to avoid toothless antagonists, you want to avoid coincidence, but also really understand the genre that you're writing in, because sometimes the type of protagonist that you're going to use is actually a convention of the genre.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss Notting Hill. And to support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe. And to find out more about our courses and training, visit storynerd.ca. To join Valerie's Inner Circle, go to valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle. And for more information about my books, visit melaniehill.au. And remember, story theory does not have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.